Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Arco Forum of Public Affairs. The Institute of Politics tonight is extremely pleased to be able to present to you Harry Browne. As I think many in our audience are aware, he is a very prominent investment advisor in the United States, and he's often seen on national television in a variety of prominent programs dealing with investment issues. He's also a renowned public lecturer throughout the country, and is the author of 9 books, a number of which have been highly successful, best-selling New York Times books. Of course, his first book on the scene, which was on the New York Times bestseller list, was How You Can Profit from the Coming Revaluation in 1970, and unlike most other folks in the country, he foresaw some of the economic and political events that were coming. In 1973, he published a book called How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World, and in 1995, his most recent book is Why Government Doesn't Work. He, of course, this summer was nominated by the Libertarian Party to be its candidate for the presidency of the United States. And the Libertarian Party this year is once again, for the second presidential election in a row, will have its candidate on all 50 ballots, all 50 state ballots in this country, a remarkable achievement in American politics. The party this year has over 200 candidates in congressional elections across the United States, as well as 19 candidates for the U.S. Senate. The vice presidential candidate is Jo Jorgensen, the only woman nominated among the parties contending this year, among the significant parties contending for the presidency and the vice presidency of the United States. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the presidential nominee from the Libertarian Party, Harry Browne.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for the introduction. I'm always a little worried about how I'm going to be introduced. I once was at a gathering like this, and the gentleman who was going to introduce me said, "I'm very concerned about being accurate, and I'm a reporter, and my whole business is accuracy. And I want to be sure that I don't make any mistakes, so I'm just going to say one sentence, and then the rest of the time will be yours." And he did. He got up and he said, "Our speaker made $1 million in the gold market in London. Here's Harry Browne." And I stood up to this thunderous ovation, and when it finally died down, I said, "Gee, I really appreciate that. That was very short, just as you said, but since you were concerned about accuracy, I should mention that it wasn't the gold market, it was the silver market. And it wasn't London, it was Zurich. And you know, it wasn't $1 million. It was really more like 100,000. And it wasn't me, it was my brother. And he didn't make it, he lost it." So thank you very much for the introduction. Oh, just one thing about the never mind. What would you think if your roommate suddenly ran up a whole bunch of bills on your credit card because he got hold of it, and the credit card company presented those bills to you and said, "Well, you're going to have to pay for them now." And you said, "Well, I didn't get anything out of them. I didn't buy anything with this credit card." And the credit card company said, "It's too bad. You're responsible for this, and you now are in debt to the credit company for $13,000 or some astronomical figure." Well, by this little hypothetical example is meant to introduce the concept of government to you. The concept of government meaning that your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, your great-grandparents' generation have been using your credit card. They have been passing bills for years and years and years. I really shouldn't blame it on the generations as much as the politicians of those generations. They have been passing bills on and on, bestowing benefits on this group and that group and this group and that group, and passing the bills on to you. They have not made any provision to pay for any of these things. They have simply figured that when the time came, they could just hand the bill to you. Now, how did they know that they could hand the bill to you? How did they figure that you would stand still for this and not have a tremendous backlash against them? Well, for one thing, your generation doesn't vote. the way other generations vote. Your generation is less interested in politics, so you don't go to the polls as much. So if your generation gets mad at the politicians for having put all these bills on you, the probability is that you will not do anything to vote them out of office. I hope you prove them wrong. I hope you demonstrate that you're not going to put up with this. I hope you demonstrate that you do not think that this is fair, and I hope you demonstrate that there are better ways to handle this than just simply rolling over and playing dead. But I'd like to give you a couple of examples of how the politicians have handled these matters for you. Let's take the great and wonderful American institution that is almost always brought up as the first example that government works, Social Security. When you get out into the workforce, will find that 15% of what you make will be taken and put into a fund called Social Security. Half of it will come right off the top of your paycheck. The other half will be paid by the employer instead of to you, to the Social Security Administration. 15% of what you would have earned is going to go into Social Security. Now, there's hardly anybody in the country that believes that Social Security is going to last very long. 2/3 of the American people do not believe they will ever get a dollar back from Social Security, despite all the money they're putting in. In the 20 to 30 age group, only 30% of the people in that age group believe that they will ever see any money back from Social Security. In fact, there are more people in your age group who believe in flying saucers than believe that they'll ever get any money back from Social Security. But nobody gives you the option to choose whether or not you will put the money in Social Security. You must put it in there. People have been putting it in there for generations, since 1935. Now, there are people retiring every year. These people are entitled to get money from Social Security. Now, where is the money going to come from? Well, they've been putting it in all their lives. The money should be there to pay out to them when the time comes. But the fact of the matter is that the politicians are incapable of leaving any money in a bank account, leaving any money lying around on the table, leaving any money anywhere without spending it. The money that has been put into Social Security by these people has been spent on other people's retirements. It has been spent on programs like pork barrel projects to build bridges in West Virginia, or a new airport in Denver that even the people of Denver don't want, or a new subway system in Los Angeles that all the people in Los Angeles think is a joke. All of this money has gone out. They've even sent it to foreign countries to help those countries pay off their debts. Whatever, the money is not there in the trust fund to pay these retired people. So the politicians come and take the money from you. And this is what is going to make it possible for your grandparents to retire and other people's grandparents to retire. But what is going to happen by the time that you retire? Most people who look at the subject of Social Security realize that as every year goes by, it gets harder and harder to get the money out of the younger generations to pay for the older generations, because more and more people are retiring and fewer people are coming into the workforce. And the result is that they are going to have to raise the taxes on Social Security. What is 15% now may become 18% or 20%. How high could it go? Well, in Denmark, the rate is 28%. In the Netherlands, the rate is 35% for Social Security. Can you imagine 35% of your income going into Social Security? Seems impossible. But in Italy, the rate is 62% of the income of the average working person goes into Social Security. That's how bad it can get. Those systems are all older than ours. And as a result, they are further along, and they are closer and closer to bankruptcy, and so the rate gets higher and higher to sustain those systems. Now, there is only one way to solve this so that you will not have to pay these enormous bills in the future. The only way that I know is to take Social Security out of the hands of the federal government once and for all, so that it has no ability for the politicians to put their hands on your retirement. What we have to do is to get Social Security completely out of the government and make sure that everybody comes out of it whole. We can't give you the money back that you've put in if you've been working already, because the money simply isn't there. It's been spent. The money isn't even there to pay the people who are dependent upon Social Security today. It can only come from further taxes in the eyes of the politicians. Now, this is a crisis that even the President's own commission recognizes is going to reach a critical mass within just a few years. And yet the president himself refuses to discuss the issue and says Social Security is not on the table. We will not talk about it. We will not touch it. We will not change it. We will not do anything to fix it in any way whatsoever. Bob Dole says, I'm not worried about Social Security. I fixed it in 1983 and I can fix it again. Well, he fixed it in '83 with one of the 4 largest tax increases in the history of the country. And I'm sure that's what he has in mind to fix it the next time. But the only possible way we will solve this crisis is by getting the politicians' hands off of your retirement and getting it out of the clutches of government entirely. Now, how are we going to do that without leaving anybody holding the bag? Fortunately, all this money that's been flowing through the politicians' hands, a little of that money has been spent on things that still have some value. They have bought a number of things with it. They have created things. They bought power companies, and they own these power companies, even though the Constitution of the United States gives the federal government no authority to be involved in the business of generating electric power. They own pipelines. They own military bases like the Presidio that are no longer in operation but are being converted into national parks or something else. They own 52% of the land in the 13 western states. They own commodity reserves, and they own tens and tens and tens of thousands of buildings all across the country. What I propose is that all of these assets that serve no constitutional purpose whatsoever be put on the auction block. And the first proceeds that come in from the sales of these assets should be used to buy private lifetime annuities for everyone who is dependent on Social Security today. Now, an annuity is simply a contract with an insurance company that says that that company will continue to pay a fixed amount of dollars every month for the rest of that person's life, just the way Social Security promises to pay. But this would be a private contract with a private company that has never broken its promises. A company like Equitable or State Farm or any other company that can prove its soundness and security and ability to meet these promises that it makes to the policyholders. And then once we have done that, to make sure that these people are taken care of and not left holding the bag, then all the rest of us should be free forever from that 15% Social Security tax, which we know is money down the drain and we will never see again. Then what happens to you? That's up to you. You will decide for yourself what you will do about your retirement. You could put maybe 5% of your income aside. Maybe have your employer deduct it and put it into a mutual fund for you, or just simply put it in a bank account, drawing 5% interest. If you start in your 20s, instead of putting 15% into Social Security, you could put 5% in your own account. By the time you are 65 years old and ready to retire, you will be a multimillionaire. In today's dollars, you will have enough money to take care of everything that you need in your retirement without any need whatsoever to rely on the federal government. You will get far more money every month than Social Security even promises. But there isn't a chance in the world that Social Security is going to last for 40 years because the American people would never tolerate a 62% tax rate on Social Security, or even a 35 or 25% tax rate. I don't believe that they could even raise the rate to 20% without a tremendous rebellion in this country. Because America is not Italy. America is not Denmark. America is still thought of as the land of the free, and that freedom still lives within us, even if we don't have it externally. So there is a way out of the Social Security crisis. There is a way to make sure that everybody is whole. And incidentally, once the Social Security system has been liquidated, we should not stop selling those assets. We should keep selling assets on the open market, and over a 6-year period get rid of all of these assets of the federal government that serve no constitutional purpose. And with the proceeds that come in after the Social Security system has been liquidated, we should use those proceeds to pay down the federal debt and get rid of it entirely if we can. Now, nobody knows how much those properties are worth. There's no way you can know until you actually put them on the market and let people bid on them. Estimates have been made of anywhere from $5 trillion to $50 trillion that these properties are worth, that might be worth on the open market. I don't know what they would bring. But consider this, if they will bring $12 trillion, that means we can liquidate the entire Social Security system without anybody being hurt and everybody being taken care of. and we can pay off the entire $5 trillion federal debt. That means there would no longer be any $300 billion a year interest expense in the federal budget. It would mean that you would no longer be taxed to pay for all the failed programs of the past that the politicians imposed upon the people but failed to fund or provide any provision for payment for, and it's just simply been mounting up as part of the federal debt year after year after year. Now, as far as balancing the budget or getting rid of the deficit is concerned, that we should do the first year, not in 7 years or 10 years, but the first year just by slashing the size of the federal government, just by getting rid of the aid to Russia, by getting rid of the farm subsidies, by getting rid of the honeybee subsidy, by getting rid of all the programs that serve no constitutional purpose whatsoever, and just simply reducing spending enough to get rid of the deficit once and for all, and do it now. But I'm talking now about getting rid of the debt itself, the accumulated deficit of 100 years, the accumulated deficit of the last 30 years that has piled up trillion after trillion dollars worth of expenses that the politicians have made no provision to pay for and expect you to pay for year after year after year in interest, and eventually somehow to settle that debt in some way. So there's one area where your life, your future, your income, everything depends upon what kind of a government we have in America. A second area is the area of taxes itself, the broader issue of taxes. On this score, I really have some good news and some bad news. Let me give you the good news first. Your parents currently pay about 48% of their income in federal, state, and local taxes. In other words, about 48% of the entire national income goes to federal, state, and local taxes. That's the good news. The good news is that if your parents are both working, one of them in effect is working for the government and the other one is working for your family. Or put another way, if you're single and out working half the time, half of the year you're working for the government, the other half you're working for yourself. That's the good news. Why is that the good news? Because the bad news is that the economists estimate that in your lifetime, you're going to pay 70% of your income in federal, state, and local taxes. That of your entire lifetime income, 70% of it will be taken away from you in taxes of one kind or another. Why? Again, because the politicians have made all of these promises and made no provisions to pay for them. And as these promises come due, as all these liabilities come forward to be paid, as all these credit card bills come to you in the mail and say, now it's time to pay off your roommate's credit card expenses, then this is going to add up to 70% of your lifetime income. Well, I don't know whether that's going to happen. I don't know whether you'll stand for it or the people of your generation will stand for it. It may simply be that the next time they try to raise taxes, that the people will rise up and say no more, as they did back in 1776. I don't know. But I do know this, that if you don't pay that 70% tax rate, then some people in older generations are going to turn to Social Security one day and it's not going to be there. Some people in the older generations are going to get sick and they're going to turn to Medicare, and they're going to find that there's a 2-year waiting period even for critical operations because Medicare is out of money and it can't force doctors to do things that they don't want to do when they decided they're better off being stockbrokers or land developers than to working for the federal government. Banks are going to fold. And the deposit insurance system will not have any money to pay off the banks, just as the savings and loan insurance system was very, very short of the money needed to pay off all the liabilities of the savings and loans that failed in the early 1980s. These debts are going to come due, and the money isn't going to be there to pay for them, unless you can be taxed at 70% of your lifetime income. There isn't a lot of time left to head this off. The only way we can do it, because this mounts up day after day after day, the only way we can hope to head it off, is if we take action now. Because otherwise there's going to be some kind of a fiscal implosion sometime along the way here in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Having come from the investment markets, I know full well that nobody can predict the future. No one can say that this is going to happen in the year 2001 or 1992 or 97 or 2010. Nobody can know. All we know is that we are heading for some kind of a financial crisis in this country if we don't head it off. How are we going to head it off? We have to get the federal government out of all of these areas. We have to take our credit cards away from the politicians. We have to take away from them the power to be able to incur these expenses on your behalf. We have to take away from them the power to run your life, to determine what is going to be done with your money. We have to take away from them the power to tax your income. We have to take away from them the power to run the country the way they have been running it. Now, the answer is not going to be to reform government programs. The answer is not going to be to find somebody who can better manage big government and can be relied upon to have our interests at heart. The answer is to reduce government to the absolute minimum possible so that no one has the power to incur these bills on your behalf, so that no one has the power to make the decisions of what you will do with your life. No one has the power to dictate the terms of a health insurance policy that you want to take out with a health insurance company. The only way to do that is to restore the Constitution of the United States, to reduce the federal government to just those powers that are actually authorized in the Constitution, just the way the 9th and 10th Amendments read, in which they say that the federal government has no power, no authority to engage in any activity, any program, any function that hasn't been specified in the Constitution itself. Now, what does this mean? Well, it's going to sound kind of drastic. It means the federal government should not be involved in welfare in any way whatsoever. And by not being involved, I don't mean taking the money from the people and then block granting it to the states, or instituting some new welfare reform that says 2 years and you're out, or workfare instead of welfare, or ending welfare as we know it. What it means is getting the federal government completely out of welfare so the money never goes to the federal government in the first place, and it has no authority to dish it out to any individual, to any state, or any corporation in the land. The federal government should have nothing to do with it whatsoever because there is no constitutional authority for it. The federal government should have nothing to do with education. It should have nothing to do with health care or agriculture or housing or transportation. It shouldn't even have anything to do with crime control, because there is nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government to pass laws against murder or theft or anything else, or to aid local police forces, or to set rules for local police forces, or in any way whatsoever to deal in law enforcement. And in fact, the Founding Fathers would be aghast at the idea of our having federal police forces like the DEA or the BATF or even the FBI, and aghast at the idea of the federal government passing laws on gun control and carjacking and discrimination and all of these things which are common crimes that should be defined at a local level and prosecuted at a local level, because all crime is local by nature. It takes place in the jurisdiction of a police department or a sheriff's department. And the idea of federalizing all of these things is the very thing the Founding Fathers were opposed to. They were absolutely opposed to having a national police force because they knew the danger that that creates. They knew that it could lead to incidents like Waco and Ruby Ridge, where federal officials gone a little bit power mad could suddenly find themselves slaughtering innocent people and invading and trampling on the Bill of Rights. That the danger was too great. And incidentally, those events, while the most spectacular of recent years, were not the least bit exceptional. Smaller such events occur all the time, every day. But back to my point, the federal government has no authority to be in any of these areas. And if we get it out of all of these areas, then you will be free to live your life as you see fit. But how are we going to do this? I mean, the federal government is good at one thing. We know that government doesn't work, that all the programs that they promise us never lead to the conclusions that are promised. We know that government can't deliver the mail on time, that it can't keep the cities safe, that it can't educate our children properly. We know that the war on poverty has created more poor people than we ever had in this country. We know that the war on drugs has escalated drug use and crime in America instead of just the opposite, which was promised for it. But government is good at one thing. There is one thing that it is very good at, and that is it knows how to break your legs and then hand you a crutch and say, see, if it weren't for the government, you wouldn't be able to walk. It has done this in area after area of the country. In healthcare, for example, the government has passed all kinds of laws to make it difficult for you to get health insurance, especially difficult at your age to get health insurance. There are laws passed that say that you have to pay the same rate for health insurance that a person 60 years old does. You're healthy, you're young, you're the best risk possible for a health insurance company. The 60-year-old, of course, has all kinds of problems and is prone to all kinds of more problems. So obviously, you would expect him to pay a rate 2, 3, 4 times what your rate is. But states all over the country have said, no, you must all pay the same rate. So suddenly the price of health insurance for a 25-year-old goes out of sight and you can't afford it. And then the politicians come along and say, gee, you can't get health insurance in this environment. The free market has failed you. Therefore, we need to pass a law forcing insurance companies to provide you health insurance at a decent price. It has run up the price of health care through Medicare, Medicaid, and all of these programs of the last 30 years. It has made the price of a doctor visit, the price of a hospital stay, the price of health insurance so expensive that senior citizens who are on Medicare now pay more out of their own pocket for health care than they did before Medicare was installed 30 years ago, even after adjusting for inflation. So senior citizens as a whole are worse off now than they were before Medicare started, simply because the federal government, by subsidizing all aspects of health care, has run the price through the roof. It has done the same thing with education. You know, in the 1950s, I wonder if is there anybody here old enough to remember that as I do. Back in the 1950s, the rule of thumb about a college education was that it cost you about, now you're not going to believe this, but about $1,000 a year was the cost that families usually estimated that it was going to take to send their children to college for tuition, books, and board, $1,000 a year. Then in the 1960s, the federal government moved in and said, we got to make it easier for families to take care of their children's education. So they started providing student loans, they started providing construction loans to schools to build more facilities, they started providing all kinds of subsidies to higher, lower, mid-education, all of them. And what do you know? The price of education started rising and rising till today. It costs $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year, depending on where you go to school. The cost has far outrun the price of it has far outrun the rate of inflation. And what is the result of all that? Well, now the government can come to you and say, if it weren't for student loans, you'd never be able to afford an education. But do you think you could afford an education somehow if it were $1,000 a year? Do you think you could find a way of raising the $1,000 without appealing to the government? Do you think maybe you could just take a job in the summer and earn the $1,000 to pay your way through college, or borrow it and not have enormous payback as you do now from your student loan for the rest of your life, or for 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it's going to take to pay it off? I'm sure you could do a lot better on that $1,000 a year tuition. You could go on down the line, issue after issue after issue. The federal government has devastated welfare in America, but the point is that the government has moved into these areas and made us dependent on it by, first of all, knocking the props out from under us and then coming along and saying, if it weren't for the government, you couldn't stand up. Now, how are we going to break this dependency? There are people all over America who are dependent on farm subsidies now, or student loans, or there are people who maybe don't get a check directly from the federal government but love their corporation for public broadcasting, or some other federal program that they feel that we just can't do without. How are we going to break this dependency? How are we going to break this umbilical cord between the federal government and millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who have become so dependent on the federal government? Well, fortunately, there is a way. If these people only understood the real cost of what they were getting, and if we could tie that cost directly to the benefit so that they could weigh it and make a sound decision. If we try to cut these programs one program at a time, we will never succeed. The Republicans tried to slow the rate of growth in Medicare. They weren't even cutting it, just tried to slow it down a little bit so that it didn't grow quite as fast. And all hell broke loose. First, all the people who were dependent upon Medicare screamed and hollered and said, no, you can't do this. And of course they had good reason to, because they knew that if you slowed down their program at all, it wouldn't make any difference in the grand scheme of things. Government would still get bigger and bigger and bigger. Taxes would still get more and more oppressive, but their program would be lost to some extent. And the same thing with any other program that you might try to cut. And who's going to come to the defense of the budget cutters? Because we know that even if they cut that program, government's still going to get bigger. Our taxes are still going to be oppressive. So what is the incentive to us to try to support the budget cutters? And the result was the Republicans never even got to first base. That isn't going to work. We can't do that. What we have to do is to wrap everything up in one giant package and say we are getting rid of all of these programs at one time. And we are going to the American people and we're going to say, we're making you a simple offer that you can understand. I want to ask you the question that I believe is the most important question in America today, and that is simply this. Whatever your favorite program might be, whatever your favorite programs, plural, would you give up your favorite federal programs if it meant you never had to pay income tax again? Because that is the question. Your program doesn't cost 20 cents a month or $15 a year or whatever the figure is that the politicians try to say it is for every American in order to trivialize it. No. You can't have your program unless everybody else gets his program as well. If you're going to have that student loan, then the farmer has to have that subsidy. And Archer Daniels Midland has to have its corporate welfare and its ethanol subsidy. And everybody else has to get his fingers in the trough as well. So your federal program actually costs $1 trillion a year. That's the cost of all of these programs, and they all add up to what we are paying in income tax. And if we are willing to get rid of them at one fell swoop, we can get rid of the income tax again. Get rid of it forever and get rid of it completely and replace it with nothing. No flat tax, no sales tax, but simply reduce government sufficiently that we don't need an income tax. We can finance national defense and the judiciary with just the revenues that are already being collected from tariffs and excise taxes, so that every dollar that you make will be yours to spend, to save, to give away as you see fit, so that $1 trillion a year that is currently being sucked out of the economy will remain in the hands of the people who actually earned it. And that $1 trillion a year is going to buy a job for everyone who can work and charity for everyone who can't work. There will be more than enough money to take care of whatever the needs are in America, because the money will be spent by people who actually earned it and will care how it's spent then, instead of by politicians who have no accountability to us whatsoever, who can spend anything they want, and if the program doesn't work, it is no skin off of their nose. And if the program costs more than was estimated, then they just simply add it to your credit card bill. This is the only way that we are going to restore constitutional government in America. This is the only way we are going to cut government down to size. This is the only way we are going to head off that fiscal explosion so that you don't wind up paying 70% of your lifetime income in taxes. This is the only way you are going to be able to grow up in a land of opportunity. Because I can tell you this, that for the last 60 years, that opportunity has become narrower and narrower and narrower. And what we have seen is instead a country in which the rich get richer because the rich have access to the political power. Because every single thing that used to be educational or scientific or medical or commercial or financial in nature has become a political issue. Because everything that must be decided in this country that used to be decided by you and your boyfriend or you and your business partner or you and your employees is now decided by politicians in Washington on the basis of who has the most political power. And as a result of that, every single thing that is decided in America of any importance is decided on the basis of what is good for Newt Gingrich, what is good for Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, Robert Byrd, Teddy Kennedy, William Weld, to satisfy their political ambitions and to shore up their political prospects, not on the basis of what is good science, what is good education, what is good medicine, or good anything else. Anytime you turn anything over to the government, I don't care what it is, welfare reform, education, Food and Drug Administration, whatever it is, you turn it over to the government, and you are making it into a political issue to be decided by politicians sitting around a table, dividing up the spoils. In other words, it becomes a political boondoggle. So don't be surprised if you're talking about welfare reform or maybe aid to Russia or whatever the bill is. That bill is probably going to include a new federal building for West Virginia to satisfy Senator Byrd, and a new subsidy for ethanol in order to satisfy Archer Daniels Midland and make Senator Dole happy, and a new research center for Massachusetts to take care of Teddy Kennedy. But as far as what the bill was designed to do, well, we'll get to that later, just so long as the political spoils are divided up first. And don't be surprised that you wind up paying for that subway system in Los Angeles that everybody in LA thinks is a joke. And don't be surprised that you wind up paying for that new airport in Denver that nobody in Denver wanted. Why? Because it was good for some politician to create this thing. Not good for you, not good for the people of Denver, not good for the people of Los Angeles, but good for the politicians. What is the answer? To elect better politicians? No. To reform these programs? No. To find somebody who knows how to manage these programs, somebody like Ross Perot who can bring the expertise of business to government? No. The answer is to reduce government to the absolute minimum possible and take away from the politicians the power to make these decisions on our behalf so that you can live your life as you see fit. Will you make mistakes? Of course you will. You'll make plenty of mistakes in your life. But isn't it better that you make mistakes and learn from them than that Teddy Kennedy and Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole make mistakes and make you pay for their mistakes? Are you going to, in some cases, even be cheated by somebody along the way? Probably will. We all do at some point in our life, make some stupid investment or some mistake and trust the wrong person. But isn't it better that we do that, lose a little bit of money and learn from it, rather than letting those cheats and the frauds and the dishonest and the incompetent go to Washington and make all of our decisions for us? Because that's exactly what happens when we try to get government to insulate us. All we do is create enough power in Washington for those people to, instead of having to attack us directly, they can go to Washington and do it with impunity then and never have to worry about going to jail. And just as one example, if any private individual had constructed and operated a system that we know as Social Security, that man would be doing 30 years to life right now. But because it's done in Washington, that man is acclaimed as a great hero and the friend of the elderly in this country. Not your friend, perhaps, but the friend of some other generation. We are at a historic moment in the history of this country, I believe. 3/4 of the American people think that government is not just too big, but way too big. 2/3 of the American people think the greatest danger to the future of America is not unemployment, not foreign competition, but the federal government. 2/3 of the American people think that federal regulation does more harm than good. We have reached a point in this country where through educational efforts and through the almighty efforts of people like Bill Clinton, George Bush, and others, the American people recognize that government doesn't work. And they are now ready for some kind of a way of cutting through this morass and getting from where we are to smaller government. The Libertarian Party is ready to step forward as the third force in America, really the second force in America, because there's so little difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on any particular issue that what we really need in America is not a third party, but a second party. And the Libertarian Party is ready to be that. These past 2 years, the party has more than doubled its membership. We are raising money this year faster than ever before. We are getting far more media attention than we have ever gotten in the history of the party. And we are building the party now so that after this election, we will amass the forces necessary to elect libertarians to Congress in '98, and I think elect a libertarian president in the year 2000. The time is coming. What has been missing is not the desire of the American people, but the roadmap, the ability to see from where they are now to where they want to go. And that has required a party, a platform, and yes, a candidate that could show them how we can get from here to there. And we are ready now to provide that to the American people. And now that they can see the way out, or I should back up, those who can see it now, who have heard the message, respond to it. And when the American people see it as a whole, I believe that we will be ready to move in the direction of much, much smaller government. Now, we could have made a great step forward this year, I think, had the Libertarian candidate, me, gotten into the presidential debates. 60 to 90 million people would have become aware of this alternative. But that's a little bit too much to expect the Republicans and Democrats to say, oh, sure, let's let anybody in who might spoil the game. They tried it once with Ross Perot. They thought they were throwing him a bone in 1992, and he wound up getting 19% of the vote. Well, they may be corrupt, but they're not stupid. And so they're not going to do that again either with Ross Perot or with me or anybody else who might be able to get on the ballot in all 50 states. All right, that's the way the game is played. Those are the rules of the game. That is why it is so important that we get as many votes as possible this year to establish the toehold, to build the party, to get people to change their registrations, to bring people in the party and help support the efforts that are going to have to be made over the next 2 to 4 years, and to build the fundraising base that will allow us to go into the next election with enough money, with enough people to have a position in every county and every precinct of the land, so that even if we don't get into the debates, our message will get into the hands of every voter regardless. But in fact, we will have the ability then to muscle our way in the debates. They wouldn't be willing to, they would be embarrassed to have them without us because of the support we will have by the year 2000. But it all starts this year. If you have been thinking about what you're going to do with your vote this year, and if you want smaller government, then you have to vote for it. Don't waste your vote. If you want smaller government, vote for it. If you want to see government out of your lives, then vote for that. Don't vote for Bob Dole because you want to get Bill Clinton out of office. Don't vote for Bill Clinton because you think that Bob Dole's election means Newt Gingrich will have too much power. Don't vote against what you don't want. Vote for what you do want so that they will know what you want. Nobody's going to interpret your vote for Bob Dole or Ross Perot or Bill Clinton as a vote for smaller government. Nobody could possibly misinterpret your vote for Harry Brown as a vote for anything but smaller government. And it will give the heart and the hope and the encouragement to all the other people in the country who feel as you do, who want to get out from under the yoke of the federal government, that there is a change coming in this country and that they should participate in it too. Our time is coming. We are going to turn this country around. We are going to make a difference. We are going to make this the land of opportunity for you so that you will have a life that is far, far, far beyond anything that my generation or the generations between us have known. We are going to make a difference, but it's going to have to start with you. And the more you participate, the faster it's going to come about. I hope you will become a part of this, not just by voting for the Libertarian Party, the presidential candidate, and all the candidates on the ballot in Massachusetts, but that you will participate and become an active part of it here on campus or out in your adult life. Let's do this. Let's do it as fast as we can. Let's turn it around, and let's make America a free country again. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 open mics for telephone. If you'll please, for questions, 2 open microphones for questioning Mr. Brown. If you'll please come forward to the microphones, we'll alternate from one side to the other. If you would, please identify yourself very briefly for the audience and for Mr. Brown, and try to keep your questions fairly short so that we maximize the time that we're hearing from our speaker this evening. We'll start right here.
How would you criticize the federal government's response to the AIDS epidemic, and how would you respond to the AIDS epidemic?
Anytime you turn something over to the government, it's going to become a political issue, and as a result, the government dragged its feet for years and not even acknowledging what was going on. Every large advancement that's been made in this country, whether it was against polio or tuberculosis or measles or anything else that's been developed in the private sector, it has only been in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years that the federal government has moved into this field, and it has no accomplishments to show for its efforts. What we need to do is to get the money out of the federal government's hands, get it back into the community where people who are concerned about these things can contribute directly to the research efforts that they are concerned with. And only then is something going to be done. And if one thing doesn't work, somebody else can be working on another avenue simultaneously, whereas in the government, politics dictates that one approach be used, and that one approach is going to be the one that is based on whoever has the most political influence. And if it turns out 10 years to be the wrong approach, 10 years has been wasted. Whereas in the private sector, somebody else may be developing an alternative method during those 10 years, which may lead to the right result.
My name's Evan Manville. I'm a first-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. My concerns are around the public lands and environmental protection issue. And specifically, how can we effectively deal with this? It seems that ecosystems cross political boundaries, so local control is insufficient, and that markets don't really deal with biospheres and species, as these aren't consumers. And therefore, who can better deal with it than imperfectly the federal government?
Well, the federal government, once again, is a political agency, and so the question of what species will even be put on the list becomes a political matter, and that can change from year to year. Species can go on and go off, whereas in the meantime, the free market provides a perfect alternative for it, and that is that those people who are concerned about a particular species need only buy up the habitat and provide the place for the species to flourish. And if they're wrong about whether that species is really endangered, it doesn't matter, because nobody else is paying for something based on somebody's decision, which may be right or wrong and which they may or may not agree with. But once we turn these things over to the government, then you have to not only work very, very hard to get what you want from the government, but you have to continue working for the rest of your life, year after year, to protect your gain, because it can be taken away next year when somebody else gets more political power than you do. And the interesting thing about all of this is that whenever we make these decisions personally, that we are going to support some program, like an endangered species program or a program for clean air or whatever it is, we always sort of intuitively imagine in our own minds that we're going to direct the program, that I am going to direct the program, that I am going to write the law that determines how this is going to be done, and I'm going to enforce the law. And if there's some dispute, I'm going to be the judge that's going to determine who's right and who's wrong in it. But that's not the way it works. Somebody much more powerful than you, more wealthy than you, somebody with more political influence is going to be making these decisions and writing the law and enforcing the law and adjudicating the law and so on. And don't be amazed when it turns out that his idea of an endangered species or whatever the issue is something completely different from yours. And in fact, the law that eventually results may be the exact opposite of what you wanted, and it may do more harm than good, as very often turns out to be the case. Now, I don't know if you want to get into all the other areas of the environment. Maybe we should leave that for another questioner. Thank you for the question, though. Yes, sir.
Well, despite its many flaws, the federal government has often, throughout the past,
Has often
in the past acted on behalf of minorities, and especially with anti-discrimination measures, civil rights laws, etc. And history has shown that when given the chance, many localities and local governments will pass laws which are either religiously motivated or racist, sexist, or especially right now, even homophobic. Without a federal government to ensure like national civil rights, without having that power, how do you think, or how do you believe that we can help create more justice for minorities within this country?
That's a very good and important question. When local governments and state governments make these kinds of bad laws and mistakes, at least we have one escape clause, and that is that as much as we don't want to do so, we can move across the state line or the county line or whatever it is, live in a certain, in the same kind of climate and atmosphere, but escape those particular laws. But when the federal government imposes the wrong laws, the only recourse we have is to move to Canada or Mexico to escape it, and that's not going to be any improvement. Now, what happens when, what would happen, for instance, if the federal government passed racist and sexist laws? Well, it has. It has them on the books right now. It has empowered federal bureaucrats all over the country to decide that your business must have a certain quota in order to prove that it is not discriminating on the basis of race or sex or sexual orientation or age or disabilities or anything else. And the only possible way you can prove that you're not is by setting up a quota and hiring on a race-conscious basis and a sex-conscious basis. The federal government has no ability to wipe discrimination out of the minds of the people in this room. It has no ability to improve racial harmony in America. It only has the ability to force people to do what they don't want to do. And when it does that, it always creates consequences that are different from what were intended. If we really didn't like the segregation laws in the South, and we really were determined that the federal government should have done something about it, then the federal government should have gone in and struck down the segregation laws and then got out. And that would have wiped out the problem that it was supposedly going to solve. But once again, the federal government never does things your way. Instead, it created an enormous bureaucracy and an enormous set of laws that were designed to prevent people from discriminating on the basis of race. Well, if it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race, well, it must be wrong to discriminate on the basis of sex. Not only of sex, but then on age, and then on disability. And one law after another was passed to make this broader and broader and broader. And if you're going to protect the feelings of black people, you've got to protect the feelings of white people. You know what this has all led to finally? In 1992 in Florida, a company named Fuqua Industries was ordered by the federal judge to provide a segregated workspace for a white woman who was afraid of blacks. A segregated workspace so that she never had to associate with blacks. Well, no, it's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. That's not what the Civil Rights Act was supposed to do, but yet it was the logical conclusion, because if you are going to worry about the feelings of black women and black men, you have to worry about the feelings of white women and white men also. And sooner or later, the federal government no longer operates on any discernible, definable rule of law, but whatever it is that a federal judge takes into his head is the wisdom of Solomon in his mind. And once again, it then becomes the case of who has the political power to enforce it. The federal government cannot solve our problems, and it cannot overrule state problems and expect to make the country whole. Yes, sir.
My name is Adam Smith, which is literally true rather than just a topical reference.
Well, I first of all want to compliment you on the many books you've written.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
They have served very well to cure my insomnia on more than one occasion.
Yes, and perhaps enhance your arguments in some respects, perhaps in other ways not. I enjoyed your talk, Mr. Brown, and I think one of the reasons why I enjoyed it is not only because of your eloquence, but clearly because of the evident clarity of your message. And I'm sure that is something which will presumably bring you some success. I have a lot of questions I could ask you. I thought it was worth asking you if you would be prepared in any way to muddy the clarity of your message for us this evening. And perhaps one way you could do that would be by perhaps enumerating some ways in which you actually believe government has been a success. And perhaps if I can just pursue the point slightly further, and actually drawing on the last questioner, it's easy to, in a sense, it's easy to knock Lyndon Johnson Great Society reformers, and it's even easy in retrospect in some ways to knock FDR New Dealers. But I wonder if you can express any sort of empathy or understanding with the intellectual arguments which went into those 19th century reformers, particularly in the generation during and after the Civil War, who perceived that there was a role for government in terms, and not necessarily the federal government, but state governments as well, but government as an entity, in ensuring and in guaranteeing a fairer society.
I wonder when like the antitrust laws and
Interstate
No,
Commerce
I'm
Commission?
thinking more of the debates in Congress during Reconstruction and the people who were interested in ensuring free public education in the South, modelled on the public education system which had been created for example, in Massachusetts in the antebellum period. I mean, I'm wondering if you can empathise and understand those kinds of debates and how that kind of fits into your intellectualization of the role of government.
Well, there will always be unsolved problems in society. That's the nature of life. There will always be ways that we can envision a better society because human wants are unlimited and human resources are necessarily limited. That's the nature of economics, is deciding how to allocate the limited resources to satisfy as many of the unlimited desires as possible. And as long as unlimited desires exist, there will always be a market for politicians to come along and claim to be able to satisfy those desires at very, very little cost. We know what the cost is in our own lives. That the cost is giving up something else. If I want a new car, I have to go without something else in order to get the car. But there will always be a market for politicians to come along and say, you can have the car and everything else also. You don't have to give up anything for it because he's going to pay for it, not you. Or it's going to come out of the great federal treasury where the money actually comes from heaven, not out of your paycheck. Whatever it is, there will always be a market for that to try to solve problems through force. Through forcing somebody else to pay for what he doesn't want to pay for forcing somebody else to do what he doesn't want to do, or forcibly prohibiting somebody else from doing what you don't want him to do. And that is always going to be a siren song. But at the very end, it still comes back to the fact that force is an unpredictable weapon. It always leads to unforeseeable consequences, and it always leads people to circumvent that force in whatever way they can, and so we never get from it what we want. And that's why a system that was Lyndon Johnson promised with the war on poverty was going to, how did he put it? The days of the dole are numbered in America. Well, he didn't tell us that the numbers were trillions. But the fact is that it has created a worse system of poverty in this country than ever existed in the history of the country before. An underclass of millions of citizens that we never had before, of people who are permanently on welfare. And you can just go on down and down and down the line, and all you do is you find the ruins of these government programs. Government doesn't work. And the American people today are sick to death of supporting a wasteful, extravagant, ambitious government at the expense of their own families. And they've had enough. And the real question today, the only issue today, is how are we going to get government out of our lives? How are we going to make it a fraction of its present size? Not whether Bill Clinton inhaled, not whether there should be tax credits for people sending children to college, not whether Bob Dole served in the Second World War or took tobacco money, or Bill Clinton designs better school uniforms than anybody else does, or Bob Dole is a better movie reviewer than Siskel and Ebert. But how are we going to get this government out of our lives? And if we say we're only going to take part of it out, we want to pick and choose, that once again implies that somebody's going to call you up and ask you which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to get rid of. The only possible way we're going to do this is to get rid of everything that is not specified in the Constitution and do it all at once. Now, is this too radical? Is this too extreme? Is this throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Well, we have to, because this is Rosemary's Baby we're talking about, and we've got to do it now. So. Yes, sir.
I'm studying at Kennedy School, and I'm from Japanese government. And I was very interested in your argument because there's the same argument going on in Japan also, because Japan is also a big government. So, and I personally very interested in that argument, but it's very long. It seems a very long way to realize, and it hasn't got a big support yet in Japan. But,
I'm sorry, what was the last?
It hasn't got big support so far in Japan, and I would like to ask you that how would you analyze your strategy and platform and on this American presidency campaign, because you haven't got so enough preference so far and on this campaign. So how would you analyze? What could you have done so far, and what can you do by the November 5th?
I'm not sure I understood the question, but let me answer one anyway. and you tell me if I'm close. How have we done in the campaign? And
right.
can you say? Well, it depends on how many people hear it. On the internet, for instance, we have a vast worldwide website where people can download articles that I've written, the campaign platform, all of these different things. The result of this widespread information on the internet is that in most of the polls that are conducted on the internet, the presidential preferential polls, I win. I come in ahead of Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, and when I don't, I come in second or at worst third ahead of Ross Perot. CNN Time, for instance. CNN, the network, and Time, the news magazine, combine on a website of their own, and they have a presidential poll, and I win that poll. But CNN doesn't mention it on CNN television, and Time doesn't write about it in Time magazine. And the same thing with All Politics that's run by ABC and Newsweek and a number of other news media. The reason for this, I believe, is that while radio talk show hosts all over America, television talk show hosts in local cities around America, daily newspaper reporters who interview me are all interested in issues and ideas, and they gladly report on this. They gladly have me on their radio or television shows. I've been on over 400 shows since January 1st alone. And this message gets out to all of that audience. But at the national level, the national media is obsessed with personalities and celebrities. Therefore, if you see an article in Time magazine or a report on ABC News about third parties, well, they start out in the first paragraph talking about the Libertarian Party, the Reform Party, the Green Party, and so on, but it quickly is transformed into a discussion of Ross Perot or Pat Buchanan or Ralph Nader or somebody that everybody recognizes the name of. Not Harry Brown, because he doesn't have that much name recognition. And what is going to happen over the next few years is that we are going to have to do one of two things. Have a candidate who has enormous name recognition, or just simply build the party to a size where whoever our candidate is, he will have instant name recognition, because there will be so many letters written to editors, so many people calling into talk shows around the country, and in every other way, the name will quickly become known, and ABC News will then pay attention to it. Once that message is then available to the American people, once somebody can ask the American people, would you give up your favorite federal programs if it meant you never had to pay income tax again, then finally we will get a referendum on big government in America. But until then, we won't. But I'm very heartened by the progress that's been made this year. We've raised far more money than ever before. The party is growing, all the things that I told you before. We've had far more media attention. 281 radio and television talk show hosts endorsed the idea of my being in the presidential debates. Newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the Arizona Republic, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Denver Post, the San Francisco Examiner, and many more endorsed the idea that the Libertarian candidate should be in the presidential debates. 4 years ago, there wasn't a single editorial that said that the Libertarian candidate shouldn't be in the debates, let alone one that said that he should be. So we have made enormous progress, and that progress is going to continue from November 6th forward. But again, it begins with this election, with voting for what you believe and voting for the Libertarian candidate and making sure that other people like you know that this is not a lost cause, and do not despair. Now, did I answer any of your questions?
Well, what I wanted to know is how do you deal with the feeling people have when you listen to you, that it's kind of unrealistic. It's very interesting, but unrealistic. I think people
unrealistic from the standpoint that the program wouldn't work, or that we will never get elected.
I mean, you'll never get accepted as a public. Never ever elected.
Well, that we will just have to disagree on for the moment. But all I can say is don't give up hope, don't despair, because there are people all over the country that feel the same way you do. I speak to non-political groups, the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, the City Club in Cleveland, the Comstock Club in Sacramento, audiences that are made up of people of all political stripes. When I get to the point in the speech where I say, would you give up your favorite federal program, if it meant that you never had to pay income tax again, suddenly heads rise up and people stop nodding and suddenly start applauding. What is happening is that people have given up hope all over America. They are very cynical. That's why the vote total goes down year after year after year. Fewer people register and fewer people vote because there's no point to it. It's cynical. There's no feeling that there's anything that can be gained by choosing between a Republican and a Democrat. And suddenly people see that there is hope across America, and we are going to turn this thing around. I have no doubt of it. Yes, sir.
I'm a fellow at the Shorenstein Center. Your critique of government was largely the economic and political powers, and your discussion of restricting government to the basic constitutional powers was basically the body of the Constitution. I wonder if you could talk about how your philosophy and program applied to the Bill of Rights and the sort of personal liberties that are in there.
Well, the Bill of Rights has no force and effect today. It is whatever the politicians and the judges and the president choose to make it, and that's unfortunate because the Bill of Rights was there for a very specific purpose. It was to establish the fact that the government could not step over a certain line, and that any time it did, it was to be struck down and pushed back. The Bill of Rights is not an arcane document. It is not an unintelligible document. It was not written in Chinese. We do not need anybody to interpret it for us. It is very plain spoken. It is very unqualified. It says you have a right to free speech, even if the government doesn't like what you say, even if the government thinks it has a compelling interest in stopping you. It says you have a right to keep and bear arms, even if some idiot in Texas shoots up a restaurant. You still have that right to keep and bear arms. It says you have a right to be safe from search and seizure, even if a DEA agent thinks you fit the profile of a drug dealer, his profile of a drug dealer. And it says that in the 9th and 10th Amendments that the federal government shall not be involved in any function, program, activity of any kind that is not spelled out and authorized in the Constitution itself. And these are very simple truths. They are very simple principles that bear no qualifications whatsoever, that hold no room for exceptions whatsoever. And they are there to be unexceptional, because once you can make exceptions, then they no longer exist anymore. The principles no longer exist. It's just a question of politicians arguing on any particular issue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And the whole idea was to take away from the politicians the idea that they could decide what was good for the rest of the country. But rather they were there to provide a national defense to protect us from foreign enemies and a judiciary which may or may not have worked out well, but that was basically what the Constitution was created and the federal government was created for. So the Bill of Rights is an unexceptional document, no exceptions whatsoever. And it's the only litmus test I would apply to a judge. Does he accept that reading of the Bill of Rights? If he doesn't, I don't care if he has the wisdom of Solomon, he'll not get my nomination. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Mr. Eichel. I'm a senior at the college. Mr. Brown, could you tell us where you stand on the abortion question?
Yes. There is nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government to be involved in this in any way whatsoever. It should not encourage it. It should not subsidize it. It should not discourage it. It should not prohibit it. It should not overrule state laws on it. It should just stay out of it completely. And I would hope that state governments would stay out of it completely, but that's not a federal issue. I happen to be strongly pro-life myself. I feel that until medical science can prove that life begins at some point beyond conception, that we ought to assume that it begins at conception and consider abortion the taking of a life. But I know that the federal government, or any government, that can't wage a war on poverty successfully, that can't wage a war on drugs successfully, is not going to wage a war on abortion successfully. And every day that we waste trying to get the federal government to do something about abortion, or any other government to do something about abortion, is a day wasted. A day that could have been spent working on constructive alternatives, such as getting rid of restrictive adoption laws, or educational efforts outside of government to show young women the alternatives to abortion, or repealing the income tax so that families can afford to stay home with their children and teach them the values that might minimize teenage pregnancies so that the question of abortion would never come up. But government is never the answer.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's John Sullivan. I was wondering what you would consider a decent monetary program for the modern age in America. And particularly, I don't know, I have a kind of crazy ideas that it really doesn't seem necessary that Well, let me just ask you a couple specific questions. Do you think that it's within the bounds of the Constitution for the Congress to give the right to print and to coin money to an independent agency like it did with the Federal Reserve Act in 1906? And also, do you think it would be a sensible idea to have some kind of gold standard or some other similar standard for the dollar?
Answers are no and yes.
Okay.
No, there's no constitutional warrant for anybody to be regulating interest rates or the size of the money supply, and to turn this over to politicians is as foolish as to turn over to politicians the right to decide what to do with your money. I want to get rid of the Federal Reserve System by repealing the Federal Reserve Act and take out of the politicians' hands the ability to manipulate the economy. I would like to see the return of an impersonal gold standard so that nobody could make those decisions for us, and money would come into circulation naturally as the economy requires it, not as politicians think would be best for the economy. The Federal Reserve System has been an unmitigated disaster in this country. It presided over the worst depression in the history of the country, the worst banking crisis, and prices have risen 15 times over since the Federal Reserve was founded, even though it was founded for the very purpose of preventing banking crises, depressions, and inflation. So it has been a failure on every count, and we need to get rid of it. Yes, sir.
Time for one more question here.
My name is Joost Bonsen. I'm at MIT. Question is, I have tremendous sympathy with your notion of a constitutionally limited government, and yet you say in your book and in your speech that government doesn't work. How then would a constitutionally limited government work?
Well, a constitutionally limited government would have less ability to go wrong and do its damage on the rest of us. You raise a very important point, because George Washington said that government is not reason, it's not eloquence, it is like fire. It is force, and like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. And how to keep that dangerous servant in check is a question that has preoccupied philosophers for thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. And the Founding Fathers did the best job anybody had done up until that point, but it obviously wasn't perfect, or we wouldn't be in the situation we are today. I think that it is important that we find ways of enforcing, let me back up, of making the Constitution self-enforcing, which it has not been up to now. And that is by taking certain things out of the hands of government that it has now. If we could do away with taxation altogether, then of course the government would no longer have the power to impose its way upon you. Even if it wanted to do foolish things, it would be doing it with the money that came from people who are willing to support it. But I don't know yet how we can do that or how we could sell that to the American people. All I know is that we need to find ways that the next time around, once we get government back to its constitutional limits, we can hold it in check. I have certain ideas in mind. One or two of them were presented in the book in the form of constitutional amendments that might be more self-enforcing than what we've had up to now. Things like the balanced budget amendment, for instance, are a joke. It says that the Congress must estimate at the beginning of the year what the revenues and expenses will be, and the revenues must always exceed the expenses. So they do that. They estimate the revenues and the expenses. The end of the fiscal year comes, and they say, oh, you know what happened? We didn't take in as much money as we thought we would. And, you know, we spent more than we expected to. Gosh, that's terrible. We'll do better next year. So what we need is a constitutional amendment that says Congress cannot appropriate for this fiscal year any more money than it took in last fiscal year, and the day it has spent all that it took in last fiscal year, the government must shut down and remain shut down until the new fiscal year starts. Now, is that extreme and dangerous and drastic? Yes. And as a result, maybe the congressman would pay attention during the year then to expenses and make sure that they never ran out before the end of the fiscal year. But even there, some kind of mechanism has to be found so that they can't just simply declare an emergency or something else and take more money out of the till. You raise a very important question. All I know is that if we succeed in this venture, we will create for our children and our grandchildren 2 generations of freedom, perhaps. And I pray that during those 2 generations that they will find the answers to questions that we have not yet found. But at least then, even if they don't succeed in that, we will at least have given them 2 generations to live in a free country, to live in a land of opportunity where the government doesn't have first claim on their pay, where the government doesn't shred the Bill of Rights in the name of fighting drugs or immorality or tobacco or alcohol or anything else, but simply allows American citizens to work out their own problem in their own way, and for families to raise their children according to their values and not the values of Bill Clinton or Bob Dole or some other politician. If all we get from this is 2 generations for our children and our grandchildren, I will feel that the effort has been worthwhile. And I hope that this is enough to inspire you too, because it will be your 2 generations that will profit from it. We will look with benign happiness on everything that you get from it, but it is you who will be able to live in it. And it is you who has the greatest motivation to do something about this, and I hope you will be fired up enough to do something, because you've got the strength, the energy, and the intelligence to do it. So once again, I say, let's get busy and make this a free country. Thank you very much.